All right, we are still going to stay, of course, related to this. We have another economist, that's Mr. Bismarck, also joining us to get his views on some of these meetings and other issues. Mr. Rawani, good morning and welcome to the program.
Good morning, Nini. Thank you for having me this morning.
Great. So, I mean, Professor Eke was just talking about, you know, the talks and all of that and what should be the focus for Nigeria at this time, at the spring meetings. What for you should be the focus?
I think, again, the focus is about maintaining domestic economic stability. The entire world is roiled by what's happening between Jerome Powell and President Trump, the tariffs and the reciprocal tariffs, the trade wars. So there's nothing we can do about that. We are too small, too irrelevant to have an impact. So what we need to do is to ask ourselves where our strengths are. Our strengths are that we are producing oil. The price of oil has, according to you, it's increased to $70 a barrel. But the dollar of today, the dollar you earn today, is equivalent to 90% of the value of the dollar 4 weeks ago. Therefore, even though your nominal price of oil is $70 a barrel, the effective price and the relative price of oil is down to about $62 a barrel. Because at that time, the pound was trading at about 1.24, 1.25. Today, the pound is trading at about 1.33 to the dollar. So the dollar has become a weaker currency, and it's become a problem. So effectively, our buffers, which we have, our reserves, are not as robust as they were because the value of what we have has actually dropped. But this is a temporary phenomenon. What I'm saying is that at this point in time, we should be focusing on the production of oil so that our fiscal deficit is not in a negative position. And also, where we can see that our imports are beginning to drop sharply. So generally speaking, I look at what we can do. Today, our money supply growth, which was just announced, is at 24% higher than last year's 114 trillion. Once your money supply begins to grow, you now need to tighten a little bit to bring some stability in that system. Cash outside the M1, which is cash, is actually about almost 5.4 trillion, almost 6 trillion naira compared to what it was last year. So there's a lot of cash in the system. There is a money supply is growing, even though compared to 2024 it's lower, but it is a major threat. So once your money supply begins to grow at this rate, and your oil production is dropping to about 1.4 million barrels, it means the pressure on your currency is going to continue. We can see that our gross reserves have actually dropped below $38 billion, about $37.2 billion right now. So there are some threats, but the good thing is that the threats are not as potent as they were at this time last year. Therefore, our ability to navigate ourselves out of this global crisis and domestic crisis is much stronger today than it was last year. That is the truth. That's the true picture.
All right, Mr. Rawani, you talked about money supply, and I'm sure you saw at the end of the mission 4 by the IMF to Nigeria, they shared their observations and recommendations, and of course, one of it is to keep a tight stance. That's the CBA and the MPC should keep a tight stance. We've seen that for many months now. We've heard applause for the reforms. Does it mean we're missing it somewhere? That's why we still have this increase. I mean, 24% increase in 1 month. Isn't that a whole lot? I mean,
that is a whole lot. And why is it happening?
Yes.
Because there's some fiscal laxity there. So we need to tighten up the fiscal space, right? So that there are less leakages and that there's more control over fiscal spending and the pass-through effect of high-powered money into the system. So whether we like it or not, that is the reality. But it could have been worse if we did not do what we did. If the central bank did not do what it did last year and early this year, can you imagine what it would have been? So I think that's the first thing. We are not as vulnerable. In fact, only 2 African countries are listed as most vulnerable. I think one of it, Botswana, and another one. Now, the thing is that Nigeria is not listed as one of the vulnerable countries. As a matter of fact, Nigeria is listed as one of the countries that can withstand this shock. So what we need to do is to come back domestically and ensure that two things happen. One, we control money supply growth by tightening a little bit. Two, that we do something about our oil production so that there are no leakages at the wellhead. So if you do that, then your fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP is not going to be as high as anticipated. Also, I will not be surprised if we have to have a supplementary budget to actually rein in some of the expenditure that we had planned that we will do. We may have to cut back on some of those things because our revenues are not going to be as robust as we originally anticipated when we started this budget. And this is the same thing that's happening to all the countries in the world. That is, everybody's having to come back and recalibrate based on what is happening to the U.S. economy. Although I believe that the volatility in the U.S. market is going to be temporary, that within there's a 90-day suspension on the tariffs. I think that we will come to some kind of resolution, and therefore the dip in economic activity, global economic activity, will not be as much as widely feared today. So if that is the case, then we can easily raise our heads and then begin to grow as fast as we can, as we anticipated before the tariff wars and the trade wars.
So one of the consequences of the trade war going on is we've seen the dollar sink. I think the last story I saw about that, it went down to a 7-month low. And then we see emerging economies, even a lot of Asian, like the yen is looking so well. But, one will have to take some steps back to ask, are those emerging economic currency or even the Asian, are they really gaining value? Or is it just because the dollar is sinking? So we don't get excited for nothing.
No. You see, this is not the first time we face this kind of problem. The reality is that the dollar has lost value because of the uncertainty and the volatility index that is shown. But if you discount all of that and say, okay, let us assume that in the next month or so things will stabilize, the dollar will find its true value. The Chinese are also using their currency value, what we call competitive devaluation, beggar thy neighbor policy, to actually undercut, right, and gain market share in the export of goods. So in a time of a trade crisis and a tariff crisis, you don't make long-term decisions. You just wait for it to blow over, and then you go back to normal. We've been here before. In 1998, when there was a major crisis, we were here in 1987. We were here in 2008. We were here during the COVID pandemic. And so this is not, the world is not coming to an end because of this, what I call a temporary issue. I think that all you have to do is fast forward and say, what is the market going to be looking like? What are these economies going to be looking like at the end of June, at the end of the first half of this year? Our projections are that things will be normal, but not the old normal. In other words, some of the loss of confidence will have a much more structural effect on the US dollar and the US economy than we thought. But generally speaking, the world economy is not going to go away because there's a change of the tariff arrangements. This happened in August 1971, when the US suspended the convertibility of the US dollar to gold and also imposed a 10% tariff on all imports. That was by Richard Nixon in August 1971. We are here again 60 years later, and we are dealing with the same problem. How do we now make the currency? The price of gold is at 3,400 naira per ounce, which is the highest level it has been since we ever knew since gold was being traded. We've seen the price of cocoa at $9,000 a ton, which is great for Nigeria. But Nigeria is going to be earning about almost $2.5 billion from cocoa exports. It's going to be earning about almost $3 billion from fertilizer exports. It's going to be earning a lot. So our non-oil exports are going to be growing. Our imports, on the other hand, have come down because our currency is weaker than it was. So from a balance of payment perspective, the Nigerian economy is much stronger than it was. And when you begin to reflect on that and bring it down home, we are facing inflationary pressures right now because of supply output shortages. We are facing inflationary pressures because of power supply problems. But we are also begin to see the Dangote Group actually bringing down the price of petrol and bringing down the price of diesel. So Nigeria is benefiting to some extent from the activities of the Dangote refinery. On one hand, bringing down the cost of logistics. On the other hand, the stable naira, the foreign exchange market has helped to bring inflation. In spite of all of this, we are beginning to see inflation begin to rear its head again. And that is a big danger. So our focus as a country now is how do we control domestic inflation, food inflation, output, and ensure that we bring our fiscal deficit under control. If we don't do any of these things, then this may be another missed or lost opportunity.
Yeah, Mr. Arwani, I'm glad you said that, because at the last inflation number that we saw, obviously there was an increase, and I mean, from calculation, that's even before the impact of the trade war. We've seen the naira drop to 1,006 and has stayed there now for like 2 weeks. Of course, in between, even though now we have a reduction in the price of petrol, we also had a bit of increase then when the crude for naira policy was not reactivated. So we haven't seen those numbers reflect in the inflation number. So most likely the next inflation number might be up again. And of course,
it's going to be higher. It's going to be higher, definitely. It's going to be higher.
Exactly. And so that also feeds to the interest rates and the MPC meeting later on next month. Doesn't that take us back to where we were before, even though, you know, we are supposed to be counting the gains of the reforms?
No, it is true. It's not the fact that inflation changes direction 1 month or 2 months based on certain parameters does not mean that the war against inflation has been lost. What it means is that you've got to do some more to bring it back to the normal trend. The trend of inflation, we are convinced that the trend of inflation is going to moderate this year, but not at this time. We have some issues to deal with. We have the money, we just talked about money supply. We talked about leakages, we talked about power supply. We talked about logistics. So there are some things that need to be done, that must be done, but the most important thing is to agree and believe that the war is never over until the fat lady sings. You never say it's over. Now, so the central bank has to maintain its autonomy, its independence, and keep their anchor expectations. But the fiscal authorities have to do something about leakages and wastages. And that in the end, we've seen a change on the board and structure of the NNPC. Institutional reform is necessary at this time, because if oil production continues to drop, if there are fiscal leakages, then we will have a problem. So I'm confident that the fiscal authorities know exactly what's going on. That's why everybody's in Washington trying to ensure that things stay straight and narrow. And the IMF was very clear in its article review that we must do something about managing inflation expectations, about managing our buffers, and making sure that the impact of these reforms is transferred and distributed to the people, so that the widening gap between the haves and the have-nots in Nigeria, and the widening gap between opportunities for growth, it doesn't begin to narrow. Because if we don't do something about this, like I said at the beginning, this may be another missed opportunity. We don't want to go into the next phase of the struggle. That's how to reduce oil supply problems. We already have enough problems in River State, in Delta State now, in Escravos. You see the problems between the militants and ex-militants and new militants. All of this means that you cannot afford to have oil production at the 1.4 million barrels a day level. We need to be more like 1.7 million barrels of oil, especially now that the pricing pressure is on us. We have our work cut out for us. But the beauty is that because we did some things last year, we have some buffers that can to make us withstand those shocks. And you can see that if you look at the price of commodities that are shown on the screen, you will see that some of those commodities are beginning to increase. And the most dangerous thing today is that we have month-on-month inflation of 3.5%. When you annualize that, it gives you a 58% rate of inflation. So if monthly inflation annualized is at 58%, and annual inflation year on year is showing you 24%, the difference is almost double. It means that the structural problems, structural impediments to output are still potent, and that we have to do something. We have our work cut out for us in terms of bringing inflation down. Inflation is not going to come down as long as you have those structural problems, as long as month-on-month inflation is beginning to show those signs, and all those things that we talked about earlier on, because the inflation of March was the one that captured the fasting period. Now the tariffs are kicked in. We've seen the price of oil, petrol is now $8.90. That's good. It's better than $925. But it will take time. Prices are sticky downwards, and it will take time before we begin to see those benefits. So right now, everybody should fasten their seatbelt for a bumpy 1 or 2 months ahead of us.
All right, so we'll tighten our seatbelt. So, I mean, the expectation of domestic commodities, reducing in price, we should we should hold forth for that and wait for a bit.
I don't think it will reduce in price, but the rate of increase in price of domestic commodities is not going to be as rapid as we saw last year. So inflation measures have changed, and therefore, let's not get, stop. Let's not start celebrating. We should just monitor it, and hopefully, with money supply tightness, with fiscal responsibility kicking in, especially at the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Industry, then we might begin to have some room to maneuver, and hopefully, the global tariff war, 90-day period will come and go, and we'll be back as close as possible to normal. So I don't want us to be carried, to be doomsday analysts. We should be what we consider. We should be realistic rather than pessimistic at this time.
Yeah, but we should also face reality, Mr. Rwani.
That's what I'm saying. We are being
optimistic. We still have to face the reality, our reality at this time.
Absolutely. That's what.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Bismarck Rwani, Chief Executive Officer of Financial Derivatives Company, for your time.
Thank you for having me.